Good afternoon. I'm Dottie Gallagher, President and CEO of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Symposium. Our first event was held 4 years ago at the Hyatt Regency, and there were about 150 or so participants. Each year, participation and engagement has increased, and I'm really excited to tell you that this year we have nearly 900 registrants for today's conference, 870 to be exact. That's a record for BNP, any BNP event, virtual or in person. So we're excited to have you all here with us today. The partnership's work has been focused on helping employers create more inclusive workplace cultures. And I could ramble on about the competitive advantage of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that would be preaching to a very large choir. All of you already understand the business case for DEI, and we hope today you'll get some actionable insights that you can bring back to advance your own work. When the pandemic struck, we were forced to cancel last year's in-person event at the Buffalo Niagara Convention Center. Instead, we held a learning series, which was very successful, but we're pleased this year to get back to a full conference experience, albeit a virtual one. Perhaps what I'm most excited about is hearing directly from our keynote speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell, co-founder of PolicyLink. You'll hear more about Angela when I introduce her, but if you haven't heard her speak before, you're in for an amazing experience. Each year, this event has grown in participation and scale. Perhaps most importantly, its content has evolved. Most certainly, we are living in a slightly different, and I'd like to think improved world where we can begin to talk in earnest about building equity in our community and in our economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. I would be remiss in not thanking Clotilde Diedecker, President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo, for her support in putting on this symposium. The Community Foundation has underwritten the cost of Angela's presence here today and has been extremely generous in helping support some of the R&D work that we've done to assist employers on their D&I journeys. One of the goals we collectively set when we began this work was to be able to measure the impact that we would be having on the community at large. How were employers taking the tools that we are providing and using them to advance equity in the region? At the time, it felt like a very lofty goal, as cities such as Philadelphia and Cleveland have not been quite able to do a survey that was projectable to the entire community. During the pandemic, we released that assessment that had been in development for some time, and various people were involved, including the Race Matters Institute. The learnings from that study informed our work today, and you'll hear some of the data in the sessions, but know that today's topics are informed by what you, the business community, has told us the things that you want technical assistance with. Our results were projectable to the business community at large, and it revealed that 72% of all businesses in our region had begun their diversity and inclusion journey at the workplace. Now, we don't know exactly how that's defined. Each employer defined that for themselves, but we were pleasantly surprised that 3/4 of the community had already recognized this as an important effort and an imperative within their business. One of the other things we learned was that only 5% of businesses that set diversity, equity, and inclusion goals have achieved them. That gap between starting, setting, and achieving goals is what we're trying to close with events like this symposium. I want to say that our internal partnership work has been impacted by what we have learned. It has changed our internal hiring practice, and that's beginning to bear fruit. I'm proud to tell you, since last year, we have hired a director of diversity and inclusion, Karen Brown, who joined us from AAA of Western and Central New York. It will be Karen's responsibility to lead our programming that we do in the future to assist businesses on their journey to create inclusive workplace cultures. I want to thank Karen. She's sort of just jumped in. She's been with us for a couple months now, and it has been all symposium all the time, and she's done an amazing job, and so has our internal DEI champion, Nancy McNamara, in organizing today's event. But their leadership is only a fraction of the effort that's gone into making today successful. I also want to thank every member of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership team for their commitment and work on delivering today's program. So I'd like to begin by explaining a little bit about this virtual venue which we've created for the event. So we're going to take a look at that now. As all of you know, we are on the main stage. We're glad you made it here and you found us. We'll be here to start and end our day. Please use the live chat function, which can be found on the right beside the screen, to chat with each other while you watch the presentation. Please also use this chat to submit questions to our speakers. We will be monitoring this chat and taking your questions at the end of each session as time permits. If we don't get to your question and we're able to answer it, we will follow up after the symposium. Following our 2 speaker presentations this morning, we will move over to our micro-learning sessions. To do that, you will click on Lobby in the top right corner of your screen and then click on Micro-Learning Session 1. From there, you'll be able to choose one of 4 options. After those sessions, we will take a 15-minute break and we will head to the second round of micro-learning sessions under banner number 2, where you'll again be able to choose from 4 options. If the session you first try to join is full, choose another, and you can move among them during the day as well. During breaks, please feel free to head over to our live chat networking lounge, which is also accessible from the venue lobby. At any point, you can click on agenda at the top right-hand corner of your screen for the scheduled sessions and locations of all of this. If at any point you have any questions about the virtual space or experience or any technical difficulties, you can click on the concierge in the lobby to live chat with a support rep. You can also email info@virtualvenue.ca for assistance at any time, and we'll put this address in your chat. Before we begin today's program and welcome our keynote speaker, I would like to take a moment to thank those companies that underwrite our work and make events like today possible. Our event sponsors, Bank of America, Delaware North, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, KeyBank, and Wegmans. Our supporting sponsors, Best Self Behavioral Health, ECMC, Harder, Seacrest, and Emmerling LLP, and King Virtual Events. King Virtual Events is the platform we're on today, and I'm grateful to our affiliate organization, the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce, for helping us find King and for the work they're doing today. Additionally, I'd like to thank members of our Diversity and Inclusion Executive Council. Their wise and sage advice guides our work each and every day. So thank you to each of you for your commitment in helping us advance this work. We'd also ask you to be sure to fill out our survey before you log out today, which we will send you via the chat. Your feedback and input help shape our DE&I programming at the partnership. And as a bonus, you will automatically be entered to win one of several DE&I books specifically selected for you today. The survey can be found in the chat feature throughout the day, as well as in the networking lounge. Okay, that's all the housekeeping. So let's get on to today's presentation. And I'm so excited. We are pleased to welcome Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and resident of PolicyLink. Angela co-founded PolicyLink 22 years ago with a mission of advancing racial and economic equity for all. Through her writing, speaking, and leadership, Angela has helped to grow and define a national equity movement focused on innovating and improving public policy with a wide range of partners to ensure access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of building an equitable economy. Health, housing, transportation, infrastructure, and arts and culture are also part of the portfolio. Prior to joining PolicyLink, Angela served as Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, where she oversaw the foundation's domestic and cultural programs. A lawyer by training, she gained national recognition as a founder of the Oakland, California Urban Strategies Council, where she pioneered new approaches to neighborhood revitalization. From 1977 to 1987, she was a partner at Public Advocates, a nationally known public interest law firm. She is also the host of a recently launched podcast, Radical Imagination. Angela has also had a big impact on Buffalo's racial equity work. A colleague of Clotilde Dedecker, she worked with the board of the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo in founding the Greater Buffalo Racial Equity Roundtable and came to Buffalo to launch our Young Men of Color initiative, Breaking Barriers. I had the incredible opportunity to hear Angela in 2017 at the Walmart Inclusion Conference when I was on a panel there at their event in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I am absolutely thrilled that she is able to be with us here today. Angela will be taking audience questions, so please put them in the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. And now, without further ado, welcome Angela and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with you. And what I'm realizing in listening to the introduction that I'm talking to an audience that is not new to this topic, that has spent some time understanding how important equity is going to be to the future. And so I want to use my time to talk about what the moment that we're in, how far we've come, what's still in front of us, and the special role that you can play as business leaders as we try to improve the nation that we live in. This is an amazing moment, and I think it's just so important to stop and take it in when we have the conversation about where we want to go. The past year and a half has really changed everything. Not only have we suffered loss and pain and been thrust into situations we never thought we'd be in, and changed the way that we live, the way that we do business, the way that we stay close to those we love, the way that we have found out lots about ourselves that we didn't know before. What a time it has been. Part of what we have really experienced is that even though the notion of trying to achieve racial equity in America, trying to advance an inclusive agenda was already part of what we were doing, we have had our commitment as a nation deepened and challenged, and we're humble because of the experience. But what we know is that in order to live into the promise of the nation, we have to understand and address the things that made us so vulnerable as a nation to the pandemic. The vulnerability is because of the health crisis, but there was also a racial crisis, and it came crashing into our lives. Right from the beginning, it was obvious that low-income people of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous, would suffer the most in every way. It wasn't hard to anticipate that, but I think the full weight of it really surprised us all. I don't think anybody expected that we would see the level of death and suffering that we have seen. And we had to acknowledge that what we have been hearing about disparities in terms of access to health care, disparities in terms of access to all of the things that help people to live healthy lives, were really at the heart of what made those communities so susceptible to the worst that COVID-19 brought. We had to focus on the fact that the racial discrimination and isolation and marginalization that has been going on hurt the entire country. It certainly hurt those people whose lives were impacted directly, but the entire country had to come to a screeching halt because if a broad swath of the people who make up the nation could not be safe and could not make themselves safe, the nation was not safe. We also recognize two other things at the same time. One is that as a nation, we are so dependent on the very people who we have been leaving behind. The applause for the healthcare workers, and the healthcare workers went way beyond the doctors, way beyond the nurses, to the people who came in the ambulances, to the people who carried people to safety, to those who kept the hospitals and the other places clean. We understood the entire profession, so much of which was made up of low-income people of color, was a profession that we were dependent on. But we also saw that beyond that, to stay safe, we had to go inside, we had to stay home. And so much gratitude was put out, not just for the healthcare workers, but for the essential workers who were delivering the groceries and delivering the meals and making sure people could live safely during a really horrible time. What we saw is that those people, disproportionately often people of color, but definitely the low income, the lowest paid, the jobs that we just really haven't lifted to the point where people could live their lives with dignity, those were the people who were keeping the nation safe. But more than that, those were the people whose economic fragility actually caused the economy to have to take such a dip. Those were the people who actually lost their jobs first. Those are the ones who the community had to figure out, how are we going to deal with the homelessness problem? How are we going to deal with the hunger problem? This moment has shown us that we are indeed interdependent, that what happens to one of us happens to all of us, and that underlying the problems in this nation were the unaddressed issues of race. And we recognized all of that before the extraordinary horror of the murder of George Floyd came crashing into everyone's home. So that the racial reckoning that people often associate with those, all of that, the murder, the Black Lives Matter, all of that, that helped to really bring into sharp relief that we were in a moment of racial reckoning. But we were in it even before then. And even before we went into the pandemic, the nation had inched up to the reality that the future of the nation is dependent on the very people who are being disproportionately left behind. We already had that awareness. That's why we had diversity and inclusion. That's why we added equity to diversity and inclusion. We were understanding that. But now it's become urgent, and we must not step away. We must not step away. And there's a danger that we might. I've been really struck by the conversation that's raging across the nation right now about labor shortages. And even though the economists seem to be pretty uniform in saying that it's too early to say we have a labor shortage, there's so much data that needs to be analyzed. We also see a quick move to reduce unemployment insurance because there's a narrative developing that those generous benefits, an extra $300 a week, is actually the reason that people aren't going back to jobs. Let's not step away from the awareness that we got during this horrible period of being on lockdown for a year and a half about the quality of the jobs that people had. Let's not step away from all of us understanding how essential childcare is to be able to really work. And that if we don't have childcare, it's a real burden. Let's not step away from understanding how important transit workers are and transportation is for our lives. Let's not step away from the fact that some of the very places that want to push people back to work are places that quickly reduce the requirement for wearing masks, so that we're asking people to go into workplaces where they may not be safe. All things that we had understood before. Let's not step away from our understanding that the people who are most impacted by these issues are the very people who we ought to have in mind when we talk about our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. How did we get here? It's important to focus on that. It didn't just happen. There aren't people who are Black and Latinx and Indigenous and Asian and poor white people who are just being left behind because of lack of effort or desire on their part. It's not just bad luck. We actually live in a nation that was founded on the notion of a hierarchy of human value. I pause so we can sit with that. It's so important that we acknowledge it, that the things that were there at the beginning of the nation, stealing land and genocide, and the genocide was for the purpose of stealing the land of indigenous people. Slavery for the purpose, let me change that. Human bondage for the purpose of perpetuating slave labor for the economic benefit. That's how we started. And to start that way required a narrative of human value, a hierarchy of human value that allowed the nation to think that it was somehow okay to engage in those horrors. And that didn't just go away once we decided that slavery was over. It continued. And so even people who are Latinx and Asian and white and poor and vulnerable suffer because of a nation that actually values some lives more than others. We got to know that. And we have to know that throughout the years, things were systematically done to take wealth away from people who were Black, to be able to offer advantages to people who were not Black, and that these things are now there, part of the challenge of what we have to overcome if we really want to become a fully inclusive nation. My definition of equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. If we want to pursue that, We have to go back, look at the history, look at how that history got into our policies around education and health and housing and transportation and community development. And when we take a look, what we find out is the people who are being left behind most now barely ever had a chance. And the people who we might come in contact with in corporate boardrooms, in foundation boardrooms, in conversations with civil society where people have risen to positions of leadership, it's almost a miracle that people who are Black are in those spaces. That the people who are being left behind, that's what you would predict when people can't build wealth, when they started off with nothing despite having built the country, when people can't live where they want to live because of discrimination that still operates, that people can't get the education that they need in order to be able to present themselves as being fully qualified because we have underinvested in segregated public schools, that we have kept segregated even after segregation was made illegal. That people in communities get treated, particularly the young Black and Latinx men, as if they are criminals from the time they are 5 years old. How is it that we expect that people could have overcome all of that and we can just put it behind us? People who have suffered can't put it behind them, and we who have had opportunities cannot put it behind ourselves either. That's how we got here. But this equity opportunity is here for the grabbing. It's here for the grabbing. And the good news is that the equity journey isn't just something that we do for others out of moral obligation, and we certainly have it. We certainly have a moral obligation to be able to invest in those who have been placed at such disadvantage by our policies, both public and private. But there's good economic reason to do it as well. You all know this, that by 2044 or so, the majority of the people in the nation will be people of color, Asian, Latinx, indigenous, Black, mixed. But we don't have to wait for 2044. Already, since 2012, the majority of all babies born in this country have been of color. Since about 2018, 2019, the majority of children in the lower grades in elementary school are of color. This past year, 2020, the majority of all children 18 and under in this nation are of color. By 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. That we have a nation in which people who are white are older and people who are of color are younger. The median age for people who are white is about 42. The median age for people who are Latinx, which is the fastest growing group of people of color, is about 28. And so we already see that those who are starting families and building their lives and bringing entrepreneurship and making their democracy vibrant, they're already majority people of color. So the good news is that this is a gift to the nation. So much of the world is wringing its hands about having such an old population. We're still young and vibrant in this country. And if we could get the equity agenda right, the economy would just flourish. In 2017, if we had gotten rid of racial differences, discrimination in terms of income, I'm not saying everybody makes the same, but the bell curve would have no racial differences. The GDP would have been $2.8 trillion higher. And in Buffalo region, that would have been $5 billion higher. So you see, there is an economic return to equity. What I often say is that equity is the superior growth model. It is the superior growth model. So what's the role of business? Well, I wanted to spend some time talking about the urgency of the moment, grounding it in a history that we all have to own together because it is our collective history. And even though some of it is uncomfortable, we can't just push it away, say, don't talk about it, don't tell me. It's interesting to me sometimes that it's often people who are white who don't want to talk about the history. And those of us who are Black, who have to really think about what it must have been like for our ancestors to be ripped out of Africa, to have to endure hundreds of years of slavery, to come out with nothing and find that to be free was not to be free at all, to have to walk in fear, to see people hanging, lynched from trees, to have communities burned down like Tulsa. If we can bear that history, certainly people who are white should be able to bear that history. I talk about all of that because I want us to understand this isn't an isolated problem. Focusing on it is not just a bump in the road. This is the work of a generation. This is the work for the nation now. And businesses are just one part of that equation in terms of who has to be different. It's a civil society issue. It's a government issue. It's a business issue. And we all have to do our part. That on the civil society-ish part, we really stepping in. Organizations, whether they're organizing Black Lives Matter, whether they're providing services to children, whether civil society is trying to think through how do we live together differently? How do we really infuse democracy with excitement about being a multiracial democracy? That is happening. The current administration is leaning into its role, asking, how do we make sure that all of the agencies within government are advancing racial equity and not contributing to the problem of holding people back? How do we make sure that we look at transportation and education and health in the government and make it different? But business has a role to play as well. That when we think about government making sure that American people are safe, and regulating things that might make us unsafe and providing for the basics. When we think of civil society, really helping to weave together the fabric of civil society, raise the moral issues, think about how we build community and reweave the fabric of community. Business really is the economic driver. And in the end, reaching your full potential and participating and prospering requires business to be a full partner. And business really needs to understand that to advance equity, we have to think about those who have been impacted the most. I call that the curb cut effect. And you are all familiar with those curb cuts in the sidewalk that are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. That even as people with disabilities were gaining rights in the nation, those rights to work, to education, to public accommodations were really hollow if people could not actually move around the communities that they lived in. And so people in wheelchairs began to advocate for these cutouts in the sidewalk so they could maneuver. But how many times have you been pushing a stroller, pulling a wagon, pushing a cart? How many times have we been so grateful for those cutouts in the sidewalk? Those cutouts in the sidewalk actually save lives because 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross the street at the corner because of the orientation of the curb cut. The curb cut effect is just a classic example of when we solve problems with nuance and specificity for those who are most marginalized, discriminated against, made vulnerable in our society. The benefits cascade out to everyone. Once you know what you're looking for, you can see the curb cut effect any place and every place. I often say that the would-be gold standard of the curb cut effect was the GI Bill. I say would-be because the GI Bill was administered in a discriminatory fashion. And so lots of people who were Black did not get the full benefit of it. So would be, but I often think that the GI Bill made the white middle class. And let me tell you how it started. It started when, written on a napkin over a lunch, some of the people who were thinking about returning veterans from World War II recognized that, thought that about 100,000 of them might need some extra help. And they devised the GI Bill to provide some educational support and some mortgage support. Well, of the 16 million returning veterans, over 8 million of them took advantage of the education, and many more took advantage of the mortgage relief. And if you look at who the people are who have been doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers and senators and even presidents of the United States, the GI Bill was extraordinary. But the GI Bill actually laid the foundation for the mortgage work, that support that laid the foundation for the suburbanization of America, and all of that infrastructure and all that we have seen actually came from focusing with nuance and specificity on the most vulnerable. And that's what we have to do. That's what you have to do. That as you think about what businesses have to do, think about the curb cut effect. Think about the people who are most disadvantaged and discriminated against in the community, in business, and begin to solve the problem from their point of view. How do you do that? Well, one of the things you have to do is to gather the data. When you commit to equity, racial equity, you have to commit to looking at the data. Who is being left behind? Where do they live? Where do they work? What are their circumstances? Gather that data. Who are we serving? All of that data, and analyze the data. Don't just gather it to say that we know how many people we have. We know how many people or what proportion of them are of color. Analyze the data. Look if they're not people who are moving up beyond frontline workers. Why is that? Where are they falling off? Data, data, data is essential in analyzing it if you want to be able to really lean in to trying to be a partner to advance equity and inclusion. And then think about disaggregating the company. During this moment that we're in, that I talked about at the beginning of my speech, there have been so many companies that have been leaning in with resources. Billions of dollars have been committed from businesses, much of it for charitable purposes, much of it to be able to support civil society, much of it to be able to think about how to make the communities that surround these businesses that are focusing on these issues more able. But disaggregate the company, because you're more than your philanthropic arm. You are an employer. Using that data, think about what are you doing as an employer to be all in on advancing racial equity. You are a marketer. So much of what you do to try to promote your business, you're a marketer. What are you telling people about themselves? What are you telling them about your company? What are you telling them about the nation that we want to be in? How do you use that marketing? You're a producer. Are you producing goods and services that are helping communities or harming communities? And if they are neutral, how do you think about turning your business so that it actually is helping your producers and your service providers? But you're also procurement officers, that you're doing your business, but maybe sometimes others are cleaning the businesses, bringing in the lighting, providing some of the parts. How do you get equity and inclusion to every one of those elements? Disaggregate your business and hold every part of your business accountable for being able to produce the results that we know we need. This is a moment in which everybody has to ask, how do we help the nation to finally realize its potential? And that requires policy. And probably none of you as businesses have been silent on the issue of policy. When a policy is hurting your business, stopping you from being able to access things that you need, you know how to lean in on policy. You know how to add your resources and your muscle and your voice to policy when you think it impacts you directly. Well, whether or not we're an equitable country that allows all to reach their full potential impacts your business directly. It impacts your consumer base. It impacts your labor base. It impacts whether or not you can attract employees because you live in a nation or live in a community that people want to be in. It impacts you. Therefore, those policies matter too. And yet, to be really focused on these issues, you have to think about how is it that our policies around health and education and democracy and voting and investments in transportation, that all of those things are leading with equity. How do we make sure that we don't allow this moment to have been for naught? If we can just step back now and a year from now and back to business as usual. Business as usual was not good. Business as usual made a huge swath of our population really susceptible to the pandemic with no protection in terms of the healthy circumstance of their bodies and their person, but also no protection in terms of being able to live in decent housing. Part of that overcrowding was part of the problem, that we have to know that we've got to be able to improve our health as a nation, and leaning in on the policy issue is the way to do that. Bring the full force of everything you have to everything that you need. I also think this about leadership. Being a CEO, being in the C-suite, being able to influence what happens in your company, that's where the commitment to equity has to reside. I often say when I talk to businesses, if the CEO is not the chief equity officer, it's not happening. Which is not to say don't hire a chief equity officer. It's not to say don't put people or perhaps a whole department in charge of making sure that you're living up to what it is that you've set for the business. But it has to reside with the leadership that this is important. It has to get into the DNA. People have to get accountable for it. People have to know that the top of this organization has embraced the notion that we are going to be part of the future, that we're going to be leading into a place that this nation has never gone. And I want to leave you with this. Yes, it's going to be hard and it's going to be uncomfortable. That some of the conversations that we have will make you uncomfortable. But put yourself in my shoes for a moment. I've been doing this work for 5 decades. Think how many times I've been uncomfortable. Think how many rooms I've walked in where I was the only woman and the only Black person. Think how many times I've talked to people who I knew from the moment we began the conversation did not hold me with high regard. Think of the task I've given myself for my entire professional life to solve the most embedded, ugliest problem in the nation, and to get up every day, having been beat down by defeat the day before, and start again. Think how uncomfortable I have been. And yet I have moved forward, and millions of people like me have moved forward. That to go through a period in which we're a little uncomfortable to talk about issues where we don't feel that we're the experts, it's the least that we can do. If the CEO is not the chief equity officer, it's not happening. Be the chief equity officer. Thank you.
Angela, as always, you're wonderfully inspiring. And I'll just comment, this year, our organization, we're the Regional Chamber of Commerce, we hired a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that person reports to me. And we have a very small organization, but our senior management team felt that was really the place where it needed to be, and we are really committed to it. So we're living your advice. Before we get into the questions, I want to mention to the folks that are listening, Angela made a great point about data and understanding where the gaps are. And if you have not yet read the Racial Equity Dividend Report put out by Racial Equity Buffalo, it will illustrate perfectly exactly what the situation is in our community. I've asked our team to put that in the chat for you so you can download that report and see where we are. And in one of our sessions later today, the recruitment and retention session, we're going to talk about how do companies internally measure their own perceptions and work in this space. So agreed, and we have a couple tools right in our hands. So Angela, we've gotten and I remind everyone, please submit questions if you have, and we've got a handful to get started. Angela, your talk really was about we're experiencing a moment like no other. And one of the people listening wanted to know what excites you most about this, and what is the one thing that, how we could screw it up? Like, what keeps you up at night for us in terms of not taking advantage of the moment?
I have never been as hopeful as I am right now. Never. even though I must say that I've never experienced the kind of blatant pushback on acknowledging and embracing the humanity of every individual that I'm also seeing. Not that it hadn't been there. Boy, you know, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, so I'm familiar with racism and hatred. But even when growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, people didn't talk about it the way they so blatantly talk about it now. So even in that, well, given that reality, I've never been as hopeful as I am right now. I have never seen so many people willing to talk about race and commit to finally addressing the baked in racism that exists across society. Never have I heard this spoken and embraced it the way it's been. Also, the institutional leaderships during this period of lockdown. I have personally given over 100 speeches, and they have been to people with a lot of power and influence: university presidents, CEOs, civic leaders, governors, task forces that were trying to figure this out. This is a level of commitment and angst around let's get it right that I've never seen before. I also think that there's something that really could make this moment different, and that is the people who are leading the movement for full inclusion and equity bring more than we have ever had. That no time in the past have we had as many people who are Black and brown, who are leading philanthropy, who are in the C-suites across the nation, who are presidents of universities, who are mayors of cities, who are highly ranked in the federal government and in state government. And all of these people see themselves as actually trying to figure out how to use their positions of power and influence to help others understand the way forward. I have never seen the news and the media be as vocal or as diligent about trying to tell the story and the history of America and to lift up alternative voices. I have never seen sports figures and others put their popularity on the line and risk it to try to tell the truth. How could I not be hopeful? What keeps me awake at night is that it will be short-lived. This is a nation that has a very short memory, a very limited attention span, and easily bored. And it could easily move from where we are now to what's the next issue. So I have been impressed that it has not done that, I am worried that this will get just caught in one political party and will not spread beyond. I will tell you, when I was growing up, I can remember that my parents were Democrats and they always voted for the Democrats, but that there were times when people who were Republicans were also their heroes because of the stances that they took. And so it's surprising to me that as a nation, we could think about letting the moral authority of the nation reside in a single party. That worries me because we really need to have the give and take and the push and the competition among parties to make real progress. So that worries me. But my worries really stop here. That the things that are ugly right now, I think represent a last gasp of a time that was yesterday. That the future really rests with our ability to be able to build a multiracial democracy. And the possibilities of a multiracial democracy are the things that really let democracy in this nation be something we can stand on a global stage to be proud of. The world is waiting for an experiment that is positive with a multiracial democracy. And so I think that that's where we're going. And I think that that really makes everything else just the process of getting there. The ugliness is an ugliness of the past, holding on with fingernails. It's a last gasp. It could be long, dangerous, shrill, but it's last.
Well, when we talk about the role of employers, and that's for-profit and not-for-profit businesses, we do have a huge responsibility when you talk about economic mobility, right? If you can't get on a career path that helps your family create wealth, it almost doesn't matter, right? So we understand that, and I appreciate the work that PolicyLink has done on all this. So nearly a year ago, in the midst of the pandemic, PolicyLink released the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, and I think they're going to put the link in the chat for you right now so you can get to the page where you can download it. There are many suggestions in this document on everything from purchasing to hiring to communications, and it's a voluminous set of suggestions and recommendations. So I guess I want your opinion. Can you tell us, if a company has begun its journey, which recommendation or area of recommendations would have the greatest impact in a community like Buffalo, do you think? Or maybe it's not a regional specific, but it's that list of recommendations is an elephant. So what's the first bite if a company's just sort of getting their feet wet in this work that they should really focus on that will have the biggest impact?
So I do think it's important to think of achieving racial equity as a destination and a journey. A destination and a journey. We will be trying to get to the destination for a long time, but there is so much to do on the journey. And part of it is really looking at some of the basics that you have complete control over that could make a difference. The frontline workers. If you're in a business where they're frontline workers, go there first. Go there first, because that's the curb cut effect within business for achieving equity. If you want to know where are our employees who are of color and struggling with the issues that make it so hard for people to advance, go to your frontline workers. Make sure they're getting living wages. Make sure that you're paying attention to the benefits. Make sure that there are some opportunities for educational advancement. And I mentioned that as a first because that's familiar. That's familiar. They're right there. That's a very important thing to do. The next thing that I would say is to really think about the products and the services. Look at what you're doing and ask the simple, easy question: are we doing any harm? Stop the harm. There's so much that I want to see that is going to be proactive, but let's stop the harm. If you're in banking, for example, one of the things that we have seen in terms of banking studies is that we often are charging all those fees putting those fees on the people who can least afford to pay them, who are more likely to overstep their bank accounts a little bit, who are least likely to be able to have a constant balance of several $100s. Look at the things within your business, whatever it might be, that might be causing harm, and correct there. So I would say those are three things that I would really want to push, to know that it's a journey and a destination. And don't beat yourself up because you haven't arrived yet. You're on the journey, and every day you can make improvements. Look at the things that are completely within your control. You may not be in control, but completely in your control.
That's great advice. And the advice about the frontline workers is really super interesting. And I'll share with you, Angela, and the people listening, that the partnership has entered a memorandum of understanding with the Federal Reserve Bank out of Atlanta to create a benefits calculator to really help everyone understand the challenging reality it is for people who are working in lower wage jobs to really move on that bridge to economic prosperity. And the calculator, we're going to socialize that to business owners and to training organizations, and really get and policy, because it sort of will start and end, I think, ultimately with policy. So that'll be coming in September. We'll make sure we share that with you as it gets released. So we have a question from one of our audience members. It's: how can you make people understand not to be threatened by diversity or saying words like unapologetically Black?
I'm thinking about that question. Don't be threatened by diversity.
So I think what they're saying, like, is how do the people that that the discussion, I think this is what you were talking about, uncomfortable conversations and people being their authentic selves perhaps, and how can I'm assuming this person is Black who submitted the question, because saying words like unapologetically Black would imply that, but how do you make sort of majority people understand that it's not a threat, right? And I don't know if they're asking how to make it comfortable, because I think you've already said it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I think that's the question. How can you make people understand, I'm sure majority of people, that not to be threatened by DEI?
Mm-hmm. People should not be threatened by DEI because it is a business essential to be able to tap all of the assets that are going to be needed to be competitive into the future. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are not things that fall under the charity box of an organization. Right. They are essential for the business. That the majority of the young workforce is of color. If you want to attract people to work who are within this nation, you have to attract and hold and move forward with many more people of color. Therefore, creating a place where people feel they belong, where people feel respected, and where you can unleash the full potential that people bring requires that we place a priority on equity and inclusion. It's a business necessity. In order to be able to interact with the consumer public, whether it's products or services, we need to be able to tap the wisdom and experience of those people who are connected to those communities. And we need to be able to have an understanding of what kinds of services and products are going to be useful. Therefore, you need to be able to not just bring people in the entry level jobs, you need to have people at every level of production and marketing and leadership and HR. It is a business thing. And so the first thing that we have to do is get people out of saying, we're doing business over here and we're going to come over here and try to improve our humanity with diversity, equity, inclusion. Yeah, improve your humanity, but also it is business work. So getting it into the business is one way to be able to get people comfortable with it. I'm sure that everybody who's listening to me has had to learn something. And when you have to learn something, when you first enter, it's uncomfortable and you are insecure. I'm always amused when I have been able to master something or get close to mastery, when I can think back to when I was afraid to even do it and when I was certain that I would never be able to accomplish it. Everything that we have learned in life, every new plateau that we've been able to get to, every leap forward that we have made has required that we go through a period of being concerned whether or not you want to do it, afraid that you can't do it, uncomfortable and awkward in trying to do it, and you listen and you learn and you hold yourself to a high standard and you get better. The same is true here. I think that what we have,
sorry, Angela. Keep going.
Just one last thing, that the people who are already in your business, who are Black and Latinx and Asian and Indigenous, have a lot to offer. And we don't want to take people and turn them in to your equity experts because people have come to do the work and they want to be contributors just like everybody else. But when people bring forward and they tell you something, listen, because it is coming from an experience that you don't have and you can learn something.
I apologize for interrupting you there. So, it's interesting. I think, one of the things that, and I guess I want your opinion about this. I think for maybe people who are very comfortable with their lives, they're nervous of, they think of some of this as being a zero-sum game, right? And which is really why your work on the curb cut effect is so important, is to really understand that you're not really losing anything, right? It's that we're really gaining more, and somehow we've got to disintermediate that belief system that makes people feel that way, and that they're threatened in some way. I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but it feels like that's some of the pushback that we experience in sort of the business world. But anyway, last month,
Could I comment on that?
Oh, please, yes,
You're
absolutely.
absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Equity is not a zero-sum game. If you don't remember anything else from what I've said today, equity is not a zero-sum game. Equity is a superior growth model, and the curb cut where we focus on those who are most marginalized and targeted and discriminated against, when we do that well, the benefits go to everybody. And I saw a question in the chat about the attacks on democracy and the hate that's out there and what to do about it. And I just wanted to answer that question.
Please,
Because
that was the
I
next
don't really
question.
have
So
an
go.
answer. Because I don't really have an answer to that question, but I want to weigh in because that is the question. We have to defend democracy. Let me just say what my observation is about the attack on democracy, which is so chilling. What is so chilling about it is that it makes you see how embedded the racism is. That democracy for many people was only of interest and only valued when it was a democracy for white people. When the democracy actually became for all the people to participate and to have the participation begin to sway outcomes, then democracy was not as important as maintaining power among the people who always had power at any cost. I think we just have to sit with that we have to defend democracy, but before we can defend it, we have to face the ugly truth that millions of people in the nation are willing to sacrifice it to maintain the supremacy of the people who have had the power in the past. Let's say it out loud, and let's say we stand for democracy, and that a democracy that can operate within the context of difference is a democracy to be proud of.
And Angela, do you think that is similarly? I sense that we've moved from allyship to being an anti-racist, right? I mean, I feel like that's a step of kind of where the movement is going. Would you agree? And I think that in part relates to what you're saying, right? There's a certain amount of, it's easy to be an ally, right? But being sort of definitively anti-racist and speaking out, this really gets to the issue you're talking about in terms of democracy. I mean, do you see it? Do you agree? Or
I agree. I agree. I do think that one of the wonderful things that emerged over the course of the past couple of years is this idea of anti-racism and to be an anti-racist. That it is one thing to say, I am not a racist, which is a statement that does not bring with it any action that you have to take. I'm just not a racist. But to be anti-racist is to say, and I am about making sure that racism does not exist. It is an evil and we have to get rid of it. So I love moving people from just saying, I'm not a racist, to saying, as an anti-racist, what must I do? That's so important. I also think that it is so important to be able to understand that the problem of racism is everybody's problem. I have always bristled at the word ally and chastised myself for doing so because I thought, I know that people mean well. Why are you having this reaction? But the reason I had the reaction is ally suggested that you join me in my quest to solve this problem that is hurting my people so much. Well, no, this is really everybody's problem. It's your problem. And I say moving from allyship to ownership, that to live in a racist nation hurts us all. To get rid of racism will benefit us all, not just make us feel better, but it will make us be better. We will tap more assets. We will be stronger. We will understand give and take and democracy and all of those things in a different and vital way. Ownership is what we have to have. We own this problem, and together we have to solve it. It is urgent that we do so.
I think that's an excellent point, Angela. Thank you for sharing your philosophy there. So I want to ask this question because we're getting some questions about specifics about what people can do and how do we move beyond analysis. And just last month, PolicyLink released corporate insights into the CEO blueprint for racial equity, which we we shared with everyone earlier. And you can find this report also on the same website. It said, but it had 7 themes that business leaders have a deeper awareness of shared complicity in perpetuating inequity and a greater commitment to listen and learn, but also fear making mistakes and moving forward. To quote the report, it says, notwithstanding the authenticity of many business leaders' desire to make transformative changes, one key barrier holding them back is a fear of making mistakes, whether saying the wrong thing internally or doing the wrong thing externally. It's also clear that some business leaders would take bolder action if they knew other leaders were doing the same. These dynamics present significant challenges in moving forward. There are a lot of business leaders on this call today. So I guess I'm just asking you to give some guidance as to how they can move past these fears in their commitment to this work, if you have any suggestions, Angela.
Mm-hmm. I do think that this fear issue is a big one. I've heard it, it comes out of that survey, and then I've been in part of other conversations where I've heard it as well. And part of the reason that in my talk, I spend so much time talking about the moment and all that we have to do to make progress is to encourage people to understand that this is everybody's business. And this has to be core to what it is that we're doing. Therefore, the idea of making mistakes should not be any scarier than it ever is. That whatever it is that you do, you know there is the possibility of making a mistake. That if the thing that you build doesn't exactly fit the coordinates, then something bad could happen. There could be accidents, people could die. If the drugs become contaminated, if the food isn't really safe to consume, if the things that we build hurt or kill children, if we do an advertisement that is offensive and draws the ire of people whose perspective we want. Business is filled with the issue of making mistakes. And anybody who's in business gets up every day and goes to work with a checklist of the mistakes that you don't want to make, and making sure that people understand completely up and down the business how to avoid those mistakes. But yet you make them. And sometimes you get sued for them. And sometimes there's real pain in the community because a contaminated drug got into the public. You make them. And when you make them, you learn from them. You apologize for them. You accept the consequences and you move on, and you don't make that mistake again, but you will make another one. These mistakes are no different from those mistakes. So you've got to be able to view it as essential. So we can't avoid it because we might make mistakes. That's the thing that scares me, to say, oh, I might make a mistake. I might get embarrassed. There might be some bad public relations. You can't not do it because you might make a mistake. Try to avoid the mistakes, but keep going and learn from the mistakes. The other thing that I think is important is to be a part of a network. I have always been a part of a network. I have been a part of one of my most important networks for the past 23 years. And it includes people from various aspects of the work that I do, from labor, from environmental, from community building, from Latinx and Asian and indigenous communities, not more than about 10, 12 people, but that is my network of people who want the same thing in the universe, going after it with different missions, who are honest and open with each other, who they push me, they challenge me, they teach me. I think that we have to find networks of business leaders who are committed to this, where you feel safe and you can share. It's a mighty important support system when we're into an area like this. So I think finding those supports, being willing to make mistakes, learning from mistakes, but holding on to the fact that we have to do better in this regard, and we'll never do better if we shy away.
So one of our viewers is asking, how can we make sure we are supporting people at the intersections of marginalization, Black and queer folks, Indigenous and disabled people as well? And how do we, and I'm going to put another question in with that because I think they're somewhat related. How do we develop coalitions of programs with those of non-similar life experiences? So I think this is, it's really about how. I think this is a how question, right? How do you create those networks to be able to advance those conversations. So how would you?
Well, I do think it's important to recognize that it's not just people who are Black who have felt like outsiders in many of these places where business decisions are made. It's often all people of color and ethnicities that are viewed as other, that certainly gender and sexual orientation and all of those things, religion, disability, there are so many ways that people have been treated as outsiders. Mm-hmm. And once you get on the journey for racial equity, you realize that it just crosses the board. And I think that this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion really does capture it all, because the diversity goes beyond racial diversity. You have to listen and learn from the people who are occupying that status. There is so much wisdom that has not been tapped. So being able to, one, we need to have some standards in the workplace, that we need to be places of inclusion, places that are struggling to become places of belonging, and that has to be the highest standard. I always think that this notion of belonging really is the end of the journey. That is what we ultimately want. But there's a belonging with a little b that is very much part of the journey, because the belonging with a little b is how you create a space where people will come forward and tell you what they need, tell you what they want, tell you how they want to be treated. But you have to make people know that it's safe to do that, that this is the business that we're in, that is a priority from the highest points in the business. But listen to people, make it clear that the people can begin to create these agendas, make space for it, respect that space, and learn from that space. The other thing that I think, what was the second part of your question? That it was the first part was about great. What was the second part?
Oh, golly, I don't remember.
I forgot. I went on too long answering the first part. Sorry about that.
I was so enraptured with what you were saying, I lost what I was saying. So. But there are so many questions we could probably talk. We could talk all day. You know, it's interesting what you said about belonging. I was just this week touring the new tech hub in downtown Buffalo, the M&T Tech Hub, and I had the opportunity to speak with Renee Jones, our CEO, and he actually, and we weren't talking about DEI at all, but he said, you know, our goal in creating this space is really ultimately that everyone feels they belong, and that the notion of belonging as sort of the ultimate goal. And I would just secondarily comment that in the assessment we did, Angela, one of the scores that was terrible was my organization deliberately initiates inclusive activities, right? I'm messing up the wording, but the point is, CEOs can't wait for people to come to them and say, hey, this is how I feel. It has to flip, right? It's got to be more, I think that's what you're saying. It has to be more proactive and really listening to, and I will tell you, we scored badly on that deliberate initiatives to create an inclusive workplace. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Let me comment on that further. I want to put belonging and racial equity within a continuum. I really do think that when we get to the point where we will feel really good about, and all the people who come to work, all of the people that you interact with, that there is this wonderful sense that we all belong, that we are going to co-create our future, that we co-own it, that my presence here is welcome and essential, belonging. But how do you get to belonging? Because of the nature of the place where we live and the history that I have talked about, it's through racial equity. Because racial equity is the curb cut for America. It's the race issue that takes us to those who are most marginalized, targeted, discriminated against. Because within people who are transgender, it is Black people very often who are the most oppressed. Within people with disabilities, it is Black people who very often have the toughest time. Within women who are having a difficult time reaching their full potential, it's often Black women who are struggling the most. racial equity is the curb cut of full of belonging in this nation.
Mm.
So racial equity has to be focused on, and it is specific. It is specific about wages, benefits, conditions, opportunities for promotion, investment, leadership opportunities, all of those things. Racial equity is important in terms of products. Are they helping people? Are the loans available? Is the money available? Are the things that we need to build our families and our communities, are they available? Are they accessible? Are they respectful? Racial equity is the specificity. It's all about the specificity. It's all about the work. And that's when I want to come back to there's belonging involved in that as well. The way to be able to do racial equity is to be in partnership with people whose lives will be impacted if we get it right. And to be in partnership, full partnership, means that everybody can bring their best to it. And to bring their best, you have to create a space where people feel that they're wanted, that they're needed, that they're essential, and they're co-creating. And that's little b belonging. So little b belonging helps us to achieve the racial equity that helps us to big B belonging, which is the final journey.
We've got 5 minutes left and a handful of questions here. And I think just to follow up, and this is a good one to follow up what you just said, Angela. How do I, as a white person, ensure I am standing up for the right things that truly matter to the group seeking equity rather than what I perceive matters? That's a question from our audience.
Ask, and listen. Within every community, there are leaders who have devoted their lives to this. And if you can't find anybody in your community, ask me and I can refer you to somebody else. There are so many people who have devoted their lives to trying to know what is the best answer. I'm not going to say the right answer, but the best answer given everything that we have at our disposal right now. Don't just go on your assessment that I'm a good person and if I think it's okay, it's okay. That is not the standard. The standard is, are we advancing racial equity? Are we moving things along? Are the very people who we hope will benefit from this feeling good about the way that we are approaching it? Ask and build up a network of people who you're in regular dialogue with. Build it up. Start small. Build it up 1 or 2. Try to get to 5 people who you're interacting with. And if you really don't know anybody, reach out to Clotilde, reach out to me, reach out to people who you do know, who would happily sit down and take some time. Do not be afraid to express your ignorance. It's how you get rid of it.
But this is an interesting point, because the other thing that we hear a lot of is sort of the Black fatigue that Black and brown people feel because they're constantly being asked, right, Angela? So what's the balancing act there? And I guess I'll throw this other question on. There's a question in there: what are good some DEI professional networks available at the local or national level? So how do we balance that fatigue with this need for a better, deeper understanding?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that question. And I often have to catch myself for exactly that reason, because I have devoted my life to this, and this is what I do. And when I enter a room, I enter it to be able to play this role. I mean, yeah. It's like, so I don't ever mind being asked, but I appreciate that everybody didn't sign up for that. And so I suspect that in a formal way, if I ran a business, I would not assume that everybody who occupies the status that we've talked about, and there are many people who would occupy it, wants to play that role. I would issue an invitation to ask people who would like to be able to be helpful to come and think about how to have a way to test these questions out. And if it might be that group just comes together for the purpose of identifying a resource that might be outside of the company. So issue an invitation, and I hope it would be multiracial and multi-everything, and not just people of color, not just people with disabilities, not just people who are from the LGBTQ community, but a cross-section come together to say, how do we establish something internally where we can test and answer? And perhaps it needs to be internal and external. That is one way to avoid just assuming that because a person is Black, that one, they are a Black expert, they may not know either, or that they want to be that. that is a way to do it. And I think that would probably be pretty healthy and helpful.
I think that's great advice, Angela. We're out of time, which I could spend the rest of the day with you, but feel so appreciative of your time and expertise and being with us, and really for the incredibly positive impact your life has had on this work around the country and here in Buffalo. So thank you again for making yourself available to us and sharing your wisdom with us all. And I hope to see you again sometime soon.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Oh, that was awesome. We're going to be taking a quick break, and we'll see you back here on the main stage at 1 p.m. For Melissa Donaldson's presentation on building an inclusive culture. You're not going to want to miss it. Thank you all.